Hello class 9, hope you all are doing well. Students, today in this video I am going to continue the same chapter in biology, that is your pollination and fertilization. In previous video we had discussed about the self-pollination and cross-pollination. Now today in this video I am going to discuss about the different agents of cross-pollination, that is your wind, air, insects, water and different animals, right? Let's start the chapter pollination and fertilization. In cross-pollination, pollen grains from the anther of one flower are transferred to the stigma of another flower, and the pollen grains need some abiotic or biotic agent such as wind, water, insects, birds or animals to transport and bring about pollination. And the most common agents are first abiotic agents. These are wind and water. Pollination by wind is called Anemophily and pollination by water is called Hydrophily. And flowers which are pollinated by animals are called zoophily. Insects pollinated flowers are called Anemophily. Birds pollinated flowers are called Ornithophily. And pollination by bats is called Hydrophily. Pollination by snail is called Malcophily. And pollination by man is called artificial pollination. Let's discuss first about the Anemophily. Anemophily is pollination by wind. Flowers pollinated by wind have the following characteristics. First is your flowers are small but not brightly colored. They do not produce scent and nectar, and the stamens have long filaments and hang out of the flower. The anthers are large and loosely attached to the filament. Pollen grains are small, light, dry, smooth and produced in a very large quantity. Why pollen grains are produced in large quantities? Because most of them they are wasted on the way before they reach to female flower. Now next is the stigmas are comparatively large, feathery, branched, broad, hairy and hang out of the flower. And examples of anemophilous plants are maize, bamboo, pine, etc. Now let's discuss the wind pollination in maize. Actually in maize, the clusters of male flowers, what they are called tassel, they are born at the apex and produce large quantities of pollen grains. And the female flowers, what they are called curve, they are born near the base in the axil of the leaf on the plants. The male flowers produce large quantities of pollen grains. As the anthers burst, the light and dry pollen grains from the outwardly hanging anther is blown away easily by the way of wind and may fall on the feathery stigma of the neighboring plant. Though maize plant is a monoecious plant, means male and female flowers both born on the same plant, still there are less chances for self-pollination. Why? Because the male flowers they mature earlier than the female ones. Now next is your hydrophily. Flowers are pollinated by water in case of aquatic plants such as hydrilla, valsinaria, etc. In such cases, the following characteristics are found. First, the pollination is brought about by the movement of water which brings the anther of male flowers against the stigmas. Pollen grains are produced in large quantities. In some plants, the pollen grains have specific gravity almost equal to that of water so that they remain floating below the surface of water. In Valsinaria, the plants are dioecious, means female flowers born on one plant and male flowers born on another plant. And in this case, the male flowers they detach and float on water till they meet the female flowers. Cross-pollination caused by animals is called zoophily, and first is your entomophily. Now next is your entomophily, means pollination by insects. Actually the chief pollinating insects are bees, butterflies, moths, flies, beetles and ants. Entomophilous flowers have the following principal adaptations. Means the characteristics of entomophilous flowers are: first, the flowers are large and brightly colored. The insect loving plants often have pleasant scent and sweet nectar. The pollen grains are rough, sticky and spiny, so that they can easily stick to the legs or wings of the insects. And the stigma is sticky and rough, as in case of China rose, lotus, roses, etc. Now next is your difference between insect and wind pollinated flowers. First is your insect pollinated flowers. These flowers have large and brightly colored petals, while wind pollinated flowers, they are small and do not have showy petals. What they don't have? They do not have showy petals. Understood? Now second point, in insect pollinated flowers, they produce scent and nectar, while wind pollinated flowers, they do not produce scent and nectar. Then next is your grains are rough and sticky, so that they can stick to the legs and wings of the insects. But in wind pollinated flowers, pollen grains are light and dry. In insect pollinated flowers, pollen grains are produced in small quantity, but in wind pollinated flowers, pollen grains are produced in large quantity. Why? Because what's happened? Because most of them, they are wasted on the way before they reach to the female flower. Right? Insect pollinated flowers, filaments are short. Right? But in wind pollinated flowers, filaments are long to expose anthers in the air. In insect pollinated flowers, stigmas are sticky, flat or knob-like, while in wind pollinated flowers, stigmas are large and feathery. Essential whorls are not much exposed in insect pollinated flowers, while in wind pollinated flowers, male and female parts are exposed to wind. They are exposed to wind. Understood? Next is your ornithophily, or pollination by birds. When the bird feeds on the nectar of a flower, some pollen grains stick to its body as the bird flies from flower to flower, and then it spreads pollen grains. The birds are usually small size but with long beak. The chief pollinating agents are hummingbirds, sunbirds, etc. Example of flowers are begonia and canna. Ornithophilous flowers have following adaptations. First is the flowers are large and brightly colored or produce abundant nectar for the attraction of birds. The pollen grains are produced in large quantities so as to ensure the process of pollination, and the flowers are scentless and the floral parts are leathery and corolla is funnel shaped. Now next is your crypterophily, or pollination by bats. Now characteristics of flowers pollinated by bats are: the flowers are open at night. As all of you know that bats are nocturnal, right? So the flowers are large sized, having large pedicel. The flowers produce lots of pollen and nectar so that they can attract the bats at night. An example is Kaizela. Now next is your Malcophily, and what is it? It is a pollination brought about by the snails is called Malcophily. Snails bring about the pollination in land plants like chrysanthemum and water plants like lamina. Snails are exclusive pollinators on rainy days. Now next is your pollination by animals. Many animals also act as a useful agents for pollination. For example, Rafflesia is the largest flower which is found in Burma and Indonesia. They are pollinated by elephants. The flowers of Rafflesia are found on the ground and the pollen grains stick to the feet of elephants and are carried to the stigma of the other flowers, bringing about cross-pollination. Let's discuss advantages and disadvantages of cross-pollination. First is your advantages of cross-pollination. Cross-pollination results in healthier offsprings, and the seeds produced by cross-pollination are much better, usually larger, healthy and more vigorous and viable. Next is your new and improved varieties of plants can be produced through introduction of new useful characters of different varieties. Weaker and defective characters of the race can easily be eliminated by the process of cross-pollination. Now next is your disadvantages of cross-pollination. First is it is not always certain and sure method. Why? Because plants have to depend upon certain external agencies for pollination, which may or may not be available at the proper time. Second is it is wasteful method. Why? Because a large quantity of pollens needs to be produced to ensure cross-pollination, and much of which goes waste. And the third is the process is uneconomical for the plant because the plants have to develop many devices such as scent, nectar, colored petals, etc. to attract various pollinating agencies. And last disadvantages of cross-pollination is that many good characters of the plants may also be lost or diluted in recombinations. Now let's see difference between self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination, it is a transfer of pollen grains from anthers to the stigma of the same flower, while in cross-pollination, it is a transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of a different plant of the same species. In self-pollination, external agencies are not required, but in cross-pollination, external agents are required. While in self-pollination, there is a little wastage of pollen grains. It means self-pollination is very economical for the plants. While cross-pollination, it is not economical as there is a lot of wastage in the production of numerous pollens, nectar, scent, color, etc. So you can say that cross-pollination is a wasteful method. Now fourth point is in self-pollination that it preserves parental characters, while in cross-pollination it does not preserve parental characters. Now your fifth point is yield decreases after a few generations, means production of crops generally falls in the successive generation in self-pollination. While in cross-pollination, yield never falls below an average. Actually, the production of crops by such seeds is very high and never falls below an average minimum. Next is in self-pollination, no useful characters can be introduced in the race. While in cross-pollination, new useful characters can be introduced in the race. Now last point in self-pollination is it can occur even when flower is closed, while cross-pollination can occur only when flower is open. Otherwise, there is no cross-pollination. Now next is artificial pollination. Man plays an important role in bringing about pollination artificially for producing useful and better varieties, especially in case of cereal crops and garden plants. In ancient time, the male flowers were brought close to the female flowers of other plant. But in modern times, artificial crossing is a standard practice adopted by plant breeders, which occurs in two steps. First is emasculation, means the pollen grains from the mature anthers of a flower from better yielding quality plant are carefully removed and dusted on the mature stigma of another plant. Then next step is your bagging, then covering the emasculated flower with the plastic bags. Means these pollinated flowers are now covered with polythene bags till fruits and seeds are produced, and the flowers are covered with polythene bags so as to prevent pollination from other sources or agencies. Okay, thank you children, and rest of the part of this chapter I'll discuss in next video.